Welcome to a super spooky edition of Monster Mondays, a series where I draw a monster from Dungeons & Dragons, and I talk about their lore, history, how to fight them, and where their origins stem from. In the lead up to Halloween, I'm going to be covering some super spooky monsters, starting off today with the vampire, one of my all-time favourites. I know I kind of say that every video, but I love Dungeons & Dragons. I love all of these monsters, and vampires are one of the most ideal things for me. I think they are fantastic because I'm a little edgelord. Before we get started with the video though, if you enjoy the content that I'm making, make sure to leave a little thumbs up, share this video with your friends, and subscribe for more content like this every week. We're a super new channel, so all of that stuff goes a huge way towards helping us out. Anyway, let's get stuck into the vampire. So vampires have always been in D&D since its inception, but they really came into their own in the Greyhawk setting when the Curse of Strahd adventure, the iconic vampire-based setting, was introduced. Now in D&D, vampirism doesn't just affect humans, it's a curse. It can affect absolutely anybody. There are dozens of different kinds of vampires out there, different classifications like Alps, Nosferats, Edimus, and so on and so forth. They all come under the classification, under the umbrella term of vampire, but they're all slightly different. In the current monster manual, we have just like one vampire that kind of covers all of those sorts of things, but they're so varied. In D&D's history, there's been so many different kinds. In the Tomb of the Lizard King adventure, in that module, which came out in 1982, there was even a vampiric lizard man, for example, so it doesn't really matter what species you are when you start off with. If you get bitten by a vampire, curse transfers to you, or the disease, however you want to frame it. No matter what you are, as long as you're alive, you can become a vampire. I mean, there's no limits to this thing. Even worse than Draco Liches, apparently there are even dragons that can become vampires and stuff like that. Probably lost somewhere within the many planes of D&D, so I don't think we'll encounter them too often. But vampires are hugely iconic. We all have an image in our heads as soon as we say the word vampire, whether they're kind of very human-like, so they can pass in cities and so on. They only have to come out at night, but they look like you or I, maybe a little bit paler, or maybe as they age, they start to show more bat-like signs, more sort of necrotic undead features as they gradually rot over time being an undead creature. We all have an idea in our heads of what they look like. They're fantastic villains, not just to fight, but they can have whole adventures based around them. I mentioned a second ago the Curse of Strahd, for example, but Dracula, all this kind of stuff, all these great stories can be the basis for fantastic whole adventures, maybe even whole campaigns for your adventurers. But where did the idea come from? I mean, it's all in our collective consciousness, but they can't surely have always been around. And I mean, we have the kind of iconic vampire accent, that kind of Eastern European, I want to suck your blood, kind of like blah, has very Slavic tones to the accent, that kind of thing. So it's not surprising that the first whispers of vampires come from Eastern Europe. But the term vampire, spelt Vampyre, entered the English language in 1734, at least in terms of monsters that needed hunting and killing, that kind of thing. It may have been around a little bit before that. Similar words like vampire, spelt Vampir, or lots of other variants like that had already been in the popular vocabulary. But it is a huge feature in superstition and folklore in Serbia, Bosnia, Croatia, Poland, all that kind of stuff. Vampires were part of the day-to-day, people would know about those legends in those parts of the world before then. And the etymology of the word's pretty unclear. In lots of different sort of old Slavic languages, they use some sort of variation of upir or apir, U-P-Y-R. I imagine in those languages the U can also be a V, sink the teeth into the W's, They all end up being very close to the Turkic word ubir, U-B-Y-R, which means witch. So we kind of already get like some magical, mischievous, dark connotations from that. The Slovak word vrepit, meaning to thrust, penetrate, bite, all this kind of stuff, may have also been tied into it, maybe merged together to become a little bit of what we understand to be like a vampire's behavior. And if you're wondering where Nosferatu comes into all of this, the Greek word nosferos, meaning plague carrier, seems to have influenced our modern understanding of how vampires come about. So we have this idea of this kind of undead, mischievous, dark kind of creature, but also plague carrying, transferring this virus from person to person. Vampires in D&D are more in line with our kind of modern understanding of vampires, like from popular media, True Blood, Dracula, Interview with the Vampire, stuff like that. They're quite human-like usually. They are undead creatures. They could pass in human society if they are human. They're often charismatic, sophisticated. I always think of Hannibal from Hannibal Lecter, that kind of Mads Mikkelsen character, the one that's kind of popularized by Bram Stoker's Dracula. But vampires haven't always looked like this in terms of folklore and legend. When they originated in Eastern European folklore, folklore, they were depicted as quite bloated and kind of ruddy skinned, very different from the kind of pale look that we have now. And that's probably because the idea of vampires as we understand them spawned from superstition related to a couple of medical conditions. I say medical conditions, the first one of those two is decomposition. So, I mean, like, that's, death, so I don't know if that counts as medical, but, decomposition either way. But, as the body begins to break down, it can cause discoloration, so maybe this ruddy colour. But also, when there were problems in towns, people were going missing, people were dying, superstitions around possibly vampires existing, or the dead. However it came about, people would sort of dig up recently buried bodies, they would open the casket, and inside they would see these people decomposing, and they wouldn't really totally know what to do. Degrading systems in the body would often cause blood to pool around the mouth. When gases and things like that are released in decomposition, it would force liquids up, causing them to bloat a little bit, and also to have this blood around the mouth. Apparently that's where the whole sort of, vampires are kind of depicted in the whole latex and, super promiscuous kind of way in modern media. Apparently a little bit of that stems from the decomposition as well, because apparently as gases would kind of force their way out of the body, sometimes on a man in particular, that would cause some very visible side effect that looked like they had maybe been out on the town enjoying themselves. The other medical condition that might have influenced the idea of vampirism is porphyria, which definitely does cause discoloration of the skin in a super interesting way. This is an absolutely fascinating disease. I'm sure it's horrendous to live through, and I'm sorry if this kind of belittles people who suffer from it, but it's an absolutely fascinating and extremely rare condition. But basically, toxins in the body are activated by light. We all know vampires in popular legend and even in D&D are vulnerable to sunlight. That might be where that comes from. This original kind of ruddy colour that they were supposed to have sometimes appears in people with porphyria because basically what it involves is your body's ability to code blood cells to carry oxygen sort of stops functioning as it should, and exposure to light can cause blood cells to sort of jam and expand and cause blockages in veins, which damages surrounding tissues, causing internal bleeding and kind of like this increased pigmentation in the skin. Interestingly, to add another layer to the vampirism sort of metaphor there, blood transfusions can stave off the conditions of porphyria. So it's not hard to imagine that maybe someone was treated for this condition by being given blood transfusions to drink. I don't know if that would work. I have absolutely no idea. But we can see a pattern forming. Porphyria can also cause muscle wastage to kind of hammer home the whole sort of undead thing. I don't know how bad it can get, but certainly if someone looks like they've just walked out of a grave, then you're certainly going to suspect that maybe they are undead. In those days when you lack knowledge of medicine, so maybe vampires come to the forefront of the mind instead before logic and reasoning, but also can cause personality changes and mental disorders. So maybe someone starts to become a little bit more aggressive than they normally would be. You've not seen them for a couple of days and they come back looking wasted away. They've got this skin color change, they can't stand the light, and their personality is becoming really unusual. They don't seem like themselves. So the idea of a vampire being in your popular culture starts to answer all the questions you're having about this person that you know. Now, it's mostly a genetic disorder, so that kind of doesn't really explain the transfer of vampirism from person to person, but apparently porphyria can be contracted through HIV or hepatitis C, but also sometimes through drinking a lot of alcohol or smoking, so maybe that goes somewhere towards explaining the kind of lavish lifestyles that vampires are supposed to have. They're supposed to be very charismatic, very, very sort of like playboy, they live forever, so they don't care, they get time to do absolutely everything, morals fall by the wayside. But how do you actually become a vampire in D&D? So we know in kind of our collective consciousness, you need to get bitten, right? In D&D it's exactly the same. You get bitten, and on top of the initial like piercing damage from being bitten, you take 3d6 necrotic damage, right? But more than just doing that damage, that reduces your maximum hit points. Just full stop. I mean, you can rest it off, you can seek medical help to get those maximum hit points back, but otherwise the bite just deals that much to your maximum hit points. If you encounter a vampire very early on, then that means that can absolutely kill you. Or if he does this midway through a fight and you're very low on hit points anyway, they can bite you. And if you die from this necrotic damage, that's how you come back as a vampire. Now the rules specify that you need to be buried after this, because you literally die, but you carry this kind of virus, this curse, however you want to shape it in the game, inside you, and once you're buried, you'll rise again as an undead, as a vampire. Now, you don't come back as a full vampire straight away. You come back as what's called a vampire's spawn, which has a lot of the same properties of being a vampire. I would go ahead and call this like a lesser vampire. You're a trainee vampire, still learning the rope. But in this form, obviously your stats improve, you get the sort of bloodthirst, you get all the trademark signs of being a vampire, but you are totally in service to the one who killed you. They are your master, 100%. You have to do everything that they say. You can't physically harm them, bound to their service. And once raised, the game frames this in a really clever way. So the idea is that your life, your personality beforehand is dead. You wake up an entirely new creature, reborn. You still have memories of that old life, but it's like you kind of watch them, like you are aware that someone has lived in this body beforehand, but that's not you. So your alignment automatically shifts to evil. And you can try and resist it, but you are an evil creature. There's nothing you can do to alter it. I would liken that most closely to psychopathy, but I'll talk about that in just a second. To become a full vampire, to become the kind of thing that bit you in the first place, you have to be in your master's service for long enough that eventually they might reward you by allowing you to drink some of their blood, and that causes you to evolve into a proper vampire. Now, in real life lore and legend, that's pretty much how it goes as well. I mean, like, sometimes it's just you get bitten and that's fine. That poses some problems for me because you would think that a vampire would just like drink someone dry, in which case, how does the virus get transferred and so on. I mean, the other problem is obviously if a vampire turns someone into a vampire for every person that they kind of drank or ate, then there would just be more vampires than people by now. And there's lots of variations on that same idea. Interestingly, one of the most fun ways that I saw is that in Slavic and Chinese stories, there seems to be kind of like a theme of if certain animals jump over a corpse before it gets buried, most often like a dog or a cat or something like that, which I think might have inspired the idea of the transformative properties of vampires that we see in, kind of Dracula. D&D vampires can also transform their shape. They can turn into dogs and other animals. So maybe that's, them saying, they actually jump over them, but then they bite them, that kind of thing, tying that in. And it's alluded to again in the kind of regional effects that vampires have. In the regional effects, we're told that upon approaching where a vampire hangs his cloak near a vampire's lair, we're supposed to see a noticeable increase in the population of bats, rats, wolves, cats, all this kind of stuff in the region. But also we learned that plants within 500 feet of the lair wither, and their stems and branches seem to be twisted and thorny. Shadows cast within 500 feet of the lair look abnormally gaunt, sometimes move as though alive, and there's a lot of fog absolutely everywhere, very atmospheric. But if the vampire is destroyed over time, these effects will go away, but it's not immediate. But what's so bad about vampires? I mean, like, they've traded their soul for immortality, we get that, and they need to drink blood in order to survive, in order to continue their life. So it's a very selfish trade-off there. They have to kill other things to live, but then we all eat meat. So, what's wrong with that? Other than the fact that this meat happens to be sentient, happens to be intelligent. It's not ideal, it's not great, but, they get to live for eternity. Eventually one of them would come up with some kind of way to remedy this problem, to maybe leave the moralistic side out of this. That's that basic plot of True Blood there, isn't it? But they're still inherently evil. They have to be evil. That's because, as I mentioned before, when you're risen from the dead as a vampire, your personality's dead. You're no longer that creature, you're something else. And they kind of become psychopaths. Not to say that psychopaths are inherently violent or evil, but the trademark is that they don't experience emotions as other people do. They have an understanding of emotions, but they don't feel them traditionally. And that's the kind of thing that goes on with vampires. It's a similar sort of feeling here, because once they're risen, they know about their former life. Like they've read a book, a really, really good book, or watched a movie of their former life, but they don't have it, they don't experience it, they don't know it. And they don't know love or joy or any other emotions, they just exist. It's an empty life, basically, is the idea that it's supposed to feel hollow because they know what they're missing out on. And they become obsessed with it. They kind of relive moments of their life over and over again and kind of wish that they could have it, but they don't know how to feel it anymore. So they kind of twist facets of their life, their previous life, into their new one to try and claim it, to try and own it. It bothers them constantly. It's like a little splinter in their brain, like, why aren't they what they were before? It becomes a dark and sinister kind of version of their previous life. So for example, like a loving husband or wife kind of turns that into obsession. So maybe they would become a stalker. They would become obsessed with their former loved one, or if they are raised long after their loved one has died, they would maybe become obsessed with owning, having partners and relationships. Maybe they become a slaver at that point. If they had a lot of friends in their lifetime, if they had very intense friendships, it kind of turns into jealousy and rivalry. Kind kind of like the other side of the coin. If they were a parent, maybe they're obsessed with children and they keep like kidnapping children. They want to have like a prodigy, you know, this kind of Batman thing with Robin. Like they have to have this like slightly creepy relationship with a child because they miss being a parent, but they don't know what that's like, so they just keep like taking people. Their emotions essentially die with their soul, and they kind of try and fill their emptiness with symbols of what they crave, what they become fixated upon. I mean, I keep thinking of Hannibal again. I think that's a fantastic TV show and it really illustrates this in a really cool way. But let's say your character's a bard and they get bitten by a vampire. Like, they know loads of stuff about music. I mean, spoilers here for the TV show Hannibal. If you've not watched that, I would definitely like skip ahead the next like 2 minutes or so. But I was watching an episode the other day, rewatching an episode where they come across a psychopath killer who is a cellist. He's fascinated with being a cellist. He plays beautifully, and cellist strings made out of catgut, and he decides to make his own kind of catgut band out of human gut. So he kills people and then wants to hear what humans sound like to play. He even opens up a human and like treats their vocal cords like string in order to play a human as an instrument. That kind of thing. It becomes a twisted, darker version of what they were before. So your bard could become this kind of like creepy cellist guy. So that's horrifying and terrifying. But what are they like to actually fight in the game? Turns out they are equally horrifying to fight. So they're a challenge rating 13 creature, which already goes to show that you're like midway through the game when you fight one of these things. They are big bads. Pretty much all of their stats are +4s. They've got 18 in everything. They are beyond human, and they're resistant to an awful lot of damage. So they're resistant to necrotic, bludgeoning, piercing, slashing, all this kind of stuff from non-magical weapons. So they're going to take half damage from pretty much anything you throw at them unless you're very prepared. They have perfect dark vision, so they can see in light, but they have the kind of drow 120 dark vision. And in terms of other stuff, they have an absolute ton of abilities. I mean, not to mention that before I read all of this, if they were a spellcaster in life, they know all of those spells. If they were a fighter in life, they know all of those skills, that kind of stuff. So you can have a vampire knight, you could have, all this stuff. They've lived a whole life that they can take with them. But on top of all that, their shape changes. They can polymorph instantly into like a bat or a cloud of mist, into wolves, all of that. They can essentially teleport. They can kind of misty escape is what they call here. It's like misty step, but it happens when they die. So the idea is that if you reduce them to 0 hit points outside of their resting place, they don't die. They instead transform into a cloud of mist, falling unconscious, and it kind of very quickly flies back to its resting place, to its kind of to its coffin in that Dracula style. So the first time you kill this thing, it won't ever actually die. On top of that, unless you deal radiant damage, holy damage, or use holy water or something like that to harm it during your turn, it will regenerate 20 hit points at the start of its turn. So it starts off with a whopping number. I'm not going to tell you how much, just for spoilers reasons, but it'll continuously regenerate as well on top of that. Without casting a spell or anything like that, it automatically has spider climb activated, so it can fight on the side of walls, it can climb up ceilings, all this kind of stuff. If it's equipped with any weapons, it can attack you with those. It has this bite that does all that necrotic damage and can turn you into a vampire, but also the unarmed, it has unarmed strikes, it has like claws, talons, metamorphosizing itself into this kind of more hideous kind of creature. I imagine they kind of have like a more humanoid or normal, whatever creature they are, normal form, and then in combat they kind of begin to transform and distort into these horrible, more bat-like creatures. So its unarmed strikes are terrifying slashing attacks, and they're super strong, so you can turn that into a bludgeoning attack. They can call swarms of animals to their aid, like rats and bats and wolves, so you're never just fighting a vampire as well, you're fighting all of its kin. It can beguile people, it can enthrall people. Just by looking at people, it can automatically kind of charm people. And you can make a wisdom saving throw to resist it, but that's quite an iconic feature, the idea that a vampire can just stare at you and you'll immediately do what it says. On top of which it has a load of legendary actions, so while you're attacking it, when it's not on the vampire's turn, it can still attack you. It gets 3 of them before its turn arrives, and they regenerate every time its turn arrives, so it gets 3 of these in the middle of other combat. It can move up to its speed, provoking no opportunity attack, so I imagine that's like another teleport, like a blink to the other side of the room if it needs to. It can make one of those terrifying unarmed attacks, and it can bite all before its turn even happens. Every turn. So they are scary to fight. So now we know we got to kill this thing. We got to kill the vampire. How the hell do we do that? Because every time we try and kill it, even if we manage to damage it more than it's regenerating, once it dies, once it drops to 0 hit points, it's always going to miss the step. It's always going to teleport back to where it's buried, right? And obviously we can try and find the body wherever it's buried and plant a stake through the heart, right? But there are some other ways. In terms of traditional lore and history, obviously staking the heart using a wooden stake, and that kind of varies from place to place. In Russia, you have to use ash. In Serbia, it must be hawthorn. In some places it's oak. In a lot more sort of Western European places, they choose aspen because that was apparently the material that Christ's cross was. The vampire became a very religious symbol. Well, demonic. Tied to religion. It's not like no one's worshipping a vampire. You know what I mean. The idea of staking came about through actually trying to deflate bloating, decomposing bodies, thinking that they were vampires. If you drained it of all the blood by jamming a giant hole in it, then obviously that'll kill it, right? In some places, iron pins were used to kind of hold vampires in place, so that even if they woke up in the middle of the night, were ready to do some killing, they'd be held into their coffin. So that ties into the idea of staking as well. Another popular one was decapitation, certainly in a lot of Slavic countries and Germany, which may have been the origin of the whole regeneration thing, the idea that you have to cut its head off to kill it. But that kind of wasn't the reason why they were doing it. It was believed for a variety of reasons. Some people would have this done medically, once they died, they thought this would really help them out, is to be decapitated and for the head to be placed underneath their butt or by their knees, because it was believed that if the head was removed, the soul that was trapped inside the body would find it easier to pour out of the neck and thus reach heaven, which would basically also help this vampire out, because clearly a decaying soul is rotting away inside this thing's chest. So that's why they were decapitated, but almost certainly it led to the idea that they regenerate, because why else would you cut their head off, right, other than to stop it regenerating? Incineration of the body is a key one. A lot of people kind of turn back to incineration of the vampire's body, and that actually will stop you from being raised as a vampire in D&D. The rules specify that you have to be buried in order to come back as this kind of lesser vampire, this vampire's thrall. So if your tradition demands that you be incinerated, to be cremated instead of buried, then you won't come back as a vampire, you're just a dead guy. And then we've got things like holy water, exorcism, crucifixes, all this kind of stuff seems to float around the lore as well. I mean, it gets weirder. Like in Saxon history, it's believed that if you put a lemon in a vampire's mouth, they would die. And sunlight's a totally modern thing. I would have thought this had gone back for ages, but the previous idea, before recent adaptations of the idea of a vampire, was that vampires preferred to come out at night, but they didn't have to. They were more active at night, but they could just be wandering around. Sunlight just wasn't their preference. It wasn't really popularized until Bram Stoker's Dracula. But I recently took a trip to Budapest, and I can kind of understand why. In the massive castle, Buda Castle in Budapest, there's a huge labyrinth underneath the castle, and it's very, very famous because Vlad Tepes, Vlad of Wallachia, Vlad the Impaler, whatever you want to call it, the basis for Dracula, the real living human guy, was imprisoned there for a few days in 1462 in this labyrinth underneath Budapest. I was lucky enough to go in and explore where he was imprisoned, and it's totally, literally a labyrinth. It's just a network of tunnels. There's no lights in there. I mean, like in Britain, we would have health and safety problems, I'm sure, but out there, they just kept it totally as it was. It was creepy as hell. Everything was really wet, cave system, no lights whatsoever. You could feel your way around by holding a rope and by using your phone light if you wanted to cheat. He was kept down there for a while, and you can kind of imagine if he ended up getting comfortable down there, people beginning to fear him and start to think, he spends so much time in the dark and he's totally fine with it. Maybe it's sunlight he doesn't like, that kind of thing. So I think that's where the idea of vampires hating or burning in sunlight might have come from. But I've got sidetracked. I was talking about how to kill vampires in D&D. So the first one is obviously if you kill it and it turns into this mist and starts to fly back to where its body's buried, it can't do that if it has to traverse sunlight or cross running water. There's a lot of stories about vampires not being able to cross running water at all in folklore and legends. If you can somehow destroy the mist while it's paralyzed in this sunlight, then you can kill the vampire for good. It also has a time limit. It only has 2 hours in which to get back to its body. So if you can somehow prolong that, move this smoke somewhere else, or grab the body and, you know, where it's supposed to be actually buried, and like move that somewhere else more than 2 hours away from where the vampire turned into this mist, then you're guaranteed to kill it. Vampires in general are harmed by running water. They take acid damage if they, you know, cross a lake or something like that. You can at least damage them that way. And don't worry, the stake in the heart thing does work. Has to be a wooden stake, has to be while the vampire is asleep or incapacitated and in its resting place, but that will kill it. And obviously, sunlight hypersensitivity, vampires take 20 radiant damage when they start their turn in sunlight. So it's the opposite of their regeneration. They'll start burning to death. And obviously, they'll turn into mist, and that mist won't be able to go anywhere because they're still in sunlight. All you need to do is like sit there and watch it for 2 hours until this thing eventually completely burns. So there you go, you are officially vampire hunters, or if you suspect some vampire hunters are onto you and you are one yourself, now you know what they're going to be expecting. But I've super enjoyed this one, guys. I really love vampires. I've always been a little bit obsessed with them. Love the idea of this kind of heavily armored knight that can also cast magic, you know, immortality, while still having that crazy vulnerability of being an undead, everything being in reverse, the complexities of not having emotions and still having this life that torments them. What can I say? Like I said earlier, I'm an edgelord. I super love them. But also, I love drawing monsters, and vampires are super creepy monsters, so I hope you've enjoyed this one as well. If you have enjoyed this video, please make sure to leave a thumbs up, share it with someone who you think might enjoy this, and make sure to subscribe for more content like this every week. I'm going to be doing more Halloween Monster Mondays in the lead up to October 31st, so make sure to join us. And I'll be doing another video every Friday as well, also a bit spooky themed. Thanks very much for joining me. Until next time, have a spooky day, and I'll see you later.